Bazinga!
Hi, I'm Chris. I'm remedying my war crimes one video at a time, and last time I talked about SpongeBob's first video game, or at least solo video game, Legend of the Lost Spatula. I liked the boss fights and I think the weapon system had potential, but overall the game was pretty bad with his screen crunch and shit platforming. Today is the day for SpongeBob's home console debut, SpongeBob SuperSponge. Let's see if this game can actually be good, unlike its predecessor. However, before we go over the game itself, we need to talk about some background. The game was developed by Climax Studios and published by THQ, like how 99% of SpongeBob games are. SuperSponge was released on the PlayStation 1 on September 20th, 2001, as well as a Game Boy Advance release for the first time on November 6, 2001. Weirdly, the PS1 version was released on the same day as Operation Krabby Patty, the first PC point-and-click game. Will I play through all the PC games, or even the handheld games for that matter? Maybe. The game sold like fucking hotcakes on the PlayStation, to the point in time where it got added to the PlayStation's greatest hits line, where it had that little green label on it. It sold very well, but the reception was very mixed in a very odd way. Game Rankings gave it a 68 out of 100, PSX Nation gave it an 83 out of 100, and Manica gave it a 36%. Something really interesting with this game is that the game's entire development cycle, including source code along with several prototypes of it, were released after Climax Studios held a bidding for studio assets. Something else about a lot of SpongeBob games that really interests me is that you can see what other Nickelodeon games these were released among. Legend of the Lost Spatula was released around the same time that Rocket Power Getting Air was released. SpongeBob SuperSponge came out around the same time another Rocket Power game was coming out, and that was Rocket Power Team Rocket Rescue, which was... Still, SpongeBob SuperSponge has a very interesting background and a very odd reputation among people, so let's see how it fares with me, the most insignificant source ever. The story is that today is Patrick's birthday, and to get him the best gift, he goes to Shady Shoals to get him a signed card for Mermaid Man and Barnacle Boy. They don't want to sign it, and in order to get him the fuck off, they send him to do random tasks all around Bikini Bottom, like making a sandwich or getting Barnacle Boy's facial. Something I noticed right off the bat that is kind of interesting is that this game does not have an antagonist. There's enemies and boss fights, but not a straight antagonist in the story that you are going against, like Plankton or the Flying Dutchman, which is something that would happen more in later games. I also like how they handle the story in terms of dialogue too, like instead of just text boxes, there are full recordings of the characters saying their lines, which is pretty cool. After the opening cutscene, you get thrown into a map where you can pick the only available level, which is Jellyfish Fields. Start the level and I can already see such an improvement over Legend of the Lost Spatula. For one, since this is not on a Game Boy Color, you can actually like see everything. Seems like a basic thing, but compared to last time, this is such an improvement. The controls are also better this time, as SpongeBob doesn't jump so high he touches the moon, and he doesn't move at a snail's pace. Even though his basic movement has gotten a very good improvement, it still isn't perfect, as now you do not have a good melee attack. Instead, you get this ground pound-like attack, which wouldn't be so bad if it wasn't the only way you can attack enemies without weapons, but it is. I feel like they should have done the same thing they did in the Game Boy Advance version, where the karate glove was always part of your inventory, and you could always use it. Still, for the most part, the controls and movement are a general improvement over whatever the fuck Legend of the Lost Spatula was attempting. And then you get to the level design, and the way it works is there are like 4 to 5 levels in each chapter, and there are 5 chapters throughout the whole game. The goal of each level is to collect an item like the ingredients for the sandwich in chapter 1, or the coins for the kelp bar in chapter 4. The level design itself is also such a big improvement, as instead of trying to be some open world mumbo jumbo, it actually tries to be like a linear platformer where all you have to do is get from point A to point B. And while yes, there is a mandatory item you have to collect every stage, it's always at the end of the level to where you can't even miss it, so it's not really much of an issue. They even replaced those like odd alternate paths in Legend of the Lost Spatula with like little crevices in the stage where you can get an extra life, which is pretty useful. Granted, there are some levels where there are more paths, like the first level in the second chapter, where you get a lot more room for navigation. There's actually this really weird difficulty curve between chapter 1 and 2, where it still isn't hard, but compared to chapter 1, there was a very noticeable bump in difficulty. One thing with the level design that really confuses me is how it sort of feels like a Sonic level, where you're meant to go fast, but SpongeBob feels closer to controlling like Mario than Sonic. It feels really out of place playing as SpongeBob in these stages when he doesn't feel like he belongs there, and the visuals do not help, but that's for later. Something else that is also very close to a Sonic game is the health system, as instead of doing something like they did in the Game Boy Advanced version, you collect golden spatulas, and when you get hit, they scatter, and you can pick them back up. If you get hurt and you have 0 spatulas, then you die. Granted, there are underwear pickups that give you extra lives, and speaking of lives, there's a life system this time. For the most part, there's nothing that even gets in your way, but the thing that really sucks is the continue system, where when you lose all your lives, you go to the game over screen and you start the level over again. The bad part is that if this happens to you more times and you haven't been saving and you run out of continues, you can get sent back to the beginning of the game. Thank fuck that I'm just like that and I never ran out of continues. The base health system isn't bad, but it's very flawed, as instead of having to actually be good at fighting enemies, you can sort of just run through them, and if you have 2 spatulas, you'll be fine. You can get extra lives by collecting all the golden spatulas, but there are exactly 100 in every level, so it can be really hard to do that. This game also has weapons like how Legend of the Lost Spatula did. It even has like some of the same weapons like a jellyfishing net and a launcher, although this time a launcher is jellyfish and not nets. While there are some items that are shared between the 2 games, they are handled completely differently, as instead of having them in your inventory and having to pause the whole game to switch to them, you collect them in certain levels and can't bring them to the next. Items like the jellyfish net and the launcher are pretty useful, and my biggest issue is that the arc on the jellyfish net is pretty low, and the launcher needs ammo that comes in these jars, which can be pretty hard to find sometimes. But these 2 weapons are mostly used in boss fights that supply ammo pretty readily, so that circumvents this. The reflow is the worst fucking item because it's super annoying to use and it makes your movement like way more slippery, and it also makes you slower as well. There are some items like the balloon which make you jump way higher, the squeaky boots that let you walk on the thorny bits that are in some levels, and the bubble wand which makes little bubble platforms that pop after a couple seconds. Overall, the weapons and items are handled pretty well here, especially compared to Legend of the Lost Spatula. Then there's the boss fights in this game, which can range from being kinda fun, I guess, to very tedious to being incredibly easy, and it's mostly the latter. For example, the boss fight with the flying Dutchman is incredibly easy because all you have to do is sit still and launch your jellyfish launcher at him when he shows up. Other boss fights, like the first one with the big jellyfish, is very tedious because of the low aim of the jellyfish net, and it makes it very hard to actually hit the boss. There were some like fun-ish fights in this game, like the one with that blue tapeworm thing. That was alright, I guess. Most boss fights in this game are not really fun or hard, but rather easy, and that goes ample for the last boss fight. The last boss is this iron dog thing that you have to freeze using these levers, and once you freeze him, you go down there and ground pound him. That sounds really fucking wrong, but you do that a couple times and you're done. Tallying up all my thoughts on all the boss fights here, my overall consensus is that the boss fights in this game are alright, I guess. Nothing worth complaining about, but nothing that's really outright fun, per se. And then there's this game's presentation, which is on point, I'd say. Graphically speaking, it does not take advantage of the PS1's power, but because of that, it doesn't have any shitty 3D models, but rather well-animated sprites. Well, for the most part. Some characters who are not in the game too much aren't animated too well, like Patrick, who just flips between stock poses, and Mr. Krabs, who just blinks. And speaking of Mr. Krabs, we gotta add another point to the counter. But then some other character sprites like Mermaid Man and Monocle Boy are very well animated. Then there's SpongeBob sprites, which use these pre-renders of a really well-made SpongeBob model, and this very well animated, truth be told. He just has a lot of idle animations, and it's awesome. Some other characters like Gary and the Flying Dutchman use pre-rendered sprites as well, which has varying levels of success, but the game still looks very nice for the most part. The levels, on the other hand, are interesting. They look great, no doubt about it, but most of the levels after Chapter 2 don't really fit the SpongeBob look. No joke, there is a level where SpongeBob goes to the center of the earth and it's this fucking lava-filled hellscape. Just imagine how that would be in the show. Why the fuck am I here? Other than Rock Bottom, no levels in this game look like anything that would be in a SpongeBob game. Hell, even though the Rock Bottom doesn't look like how it did in the show. One aspect of the presentation that is flawless, however, is the music, because good fucking lord, the composer did such a fantastic job here, both in terms of making good music and music that fits SpongeBob. Songs like Sandy Street Home hit you with that acoustic guitar and bass, then it has all the synth instruments that come in and it's just perfection. The credits theme has a fucking majestical opening that makes it sound like SpongeBob's being raptured, and then it breaks into this upbeat melody with all these random cool instruments. Shit, even the unused Game Over theme sounds great, like just listen to it. The sound effects too feel so cartoonish, and the audio clips of SpongeBob's effects during gameplay really tie this whole game together. Overall, this game has one of the best OSTs in video game history to me, and the graphics are pretty damn good too, so this game's killing it in presentation. However, the most interesting thing about this game is that in 2016, Climax Studios were closing their Climax Group branch and liquidated most, if not all of the assets. Thankfully, at least most or even all of the assets were bought by people who care about video game preservation and put them all on the Hidden Palace Archive.org and documentation on the cutting room floor. The part of this that is related to SuperSponge is how out of the 2,000 to 3,000 discs that were bought, 60 of them were SuperSponge assets, including a bunch of prototypes, source code, and assets for both the PlayStation version and the Game Boy Advance version, and so much more. Before I talk about some interesting stuff, I'd like to thank LomaBoy12 for not only buying this part of the lot, but also several other prototypes that weren't even in this lot that he has since released. Something that is on one of the development discs that is super interesting is how there are several ROMs of more popular games that are used as reference, such as Beavis and Butthead and, weirdly enough, Yoshi's Island. Actually, there's a whole document on Yoshi's Island that praises and shows how it works, and also another thing that's super interesting is SpongeBob's shit list. It is a list of issues that the game had that was being documented by some developer who must have been having the worst fucking day of his life. There's this. These were not in the source code, but rather some random archive disk. There's these funny names for these old fish, and it just keeps going on and on and on and on. It's just super interesting, and there's a link in the description for the archive.org upload of the development disk. I recommend you go check them out. Overall, this game is pretty good. I mean, it's not great or the best SpongeBob game, but out of all the SpongeBob games there are, I can easily see this one being at least top 10, but probably top 5. It's such an improvement over Legend of the Lost Spatula in every single way possible. In the general ranking, this game is in first place, and in the tier list, I'm gonna put it in A tier. I recommend you play this game. It's a good platformer, and if you're a fan of early SpongeBob, you will probably love this game. Thank you so much for watching this video, and thank you to Long Play Archives for the footage. Once again, I got that Activate Windows watermark, and I'm not leaving it in! Next time I'll talk about SpongeBob's next-gen debut, SpongeBob Revenge of the Flying Dutchman. Please subscribe to catch that video. I have a website where you can see cool things, I guess, and a Discord server, so please join that. This has been Gus Hack signing out. See ya!